With rocks and stones, we're going to be looking at a subject or a story that you all know very well. It's an exciting story. It's the biblical account of David and Goliath, and it's one of the most popular stories in the Bible. It's a lesson of courage, faith, overcoming what seems impossible. So before we look at the story itself, in some dictionaries the meaning of Goliath is giant, uncovered or revealed, but in Strong's Concordance it means exile. We know that Goliath was a champion at fighting, a man well skilled in arms. He was strong, he was brave. He was a man who tries to settle the disputes between two armies or nations. Instead of both armies going in and battling together and many people being killed, instead one person from each army would fight against the other to decide which side wins. This Goliath was a Philistine warrior from Gath and was said to be around 9 feet 9 inches tall. There are varying differences on what people believe his height was, but generally they seem to believe that it was around 9 feet 9 inches tall, which is nearly 3 meters tall, 2.9 meters. He wore armour weighing 125 pounds and carried a 15-pound spear. The picture that's recorded in the Bible about him is absolutely terrifying when we look at him. He was so intimidating. The thing I found amazing was how much detail there is about his size, about the armour that he had and the weapons that he had. There's so much detail that's in the scriptures about that. At the end, of none of those things helped him, did it? At all. Even the God of the Philistines was useless. So now looking at the story that we all know so well, the record tells us that the battle occurred in the valley of Elah. 1 Samuel chapter 17 verses 1 to 3 says that now the Philistines got their armies together for war and came together at Succoth in the land of Judah and took up their position between Succoth and Azekah, now ruins that are still there. And Saul and the men of Israel came together and took up their positions in the valley of Elah and put their forces in order against the Philistines. The Philistines were stationed on one mountain on one side and Israel on the mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. Down in the valley there was a stream bed full of stones, and when I was there we were told that a truckload of stones, small smooth stones, are placed there occasionally because all the tourists will take either one stone because that was all that was needed, or some tourists might even take 5 stones because that's what David took. We also may have expected the valley to be much deeper and the hills much closer. It does look a long way across, but across the valley for Goliath to shout out from one side to the other. But people have actually tested this, and they were able to hear very clearly from one side of the valley to the other. So the story goes on to say that David was a young man that shepherded his father's sheep and played the harp for Saul, the first king of Israel, chosen by the people. And when the war got started between the Israelites and the Philistines, a giant named Goliath told the Israelites to send a man to fight him, but no one was willing to go. Goliath shouted for 40 days, every morning and every night, but still no one went forward. No individual in Saul's army could complete could compete with the size, skill and strength of this Philistine. We're also told that David's brothers were in the Israelite army. Jesse sent David to take food to his brothers, and he saw the giant Goliath boasting that if any Israelite could fight and kill him, all the Philistines would become the Israelite slaves. I couldn't see that happening. On the other hand, if he defeated that person, the Israelites would become their slaves. The Israelite army was afraid, and so King Saul decided to promise that anyone that defeated Goliath would be given his daughter in marriage, and their family would be exempt from taxes. Despite that, nobody appeared courageous enough to come forward. That is, until David came along, regardless of being seen as unqualified in fighting Goliath. David saw the giant shouting and how everyone was afraid of him. But this young shepherd boy rose to the challenge and said that he would fight Goliath. His brothers were angry at this decision, but David knew that he was not alone and God was by his side. And what we see is that even before the battle began, different ones looked upon David as underrated or as an underestimated person in taking on Goliath. The first one was in 1 Samuel 17 verse 28, where Eliab, so David's oldest brother, heard David talking to the men. Then Eliab became angry with David. "Why did you come here?" he asked him. "And who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? I know how overconfident and headstrong you are. You came here just to see the battle." And so here his brothers only saw him as fit enough to watch over a few sheep in the wilderness. The second time David was underestimated was when he told King Saul that he would fight Goliath in verse 32. David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine." What was Saul's reply? "You are not able to go out against that Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul in verses 34 to 37, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul had no choice. He had no other option. Finally, and he said to David, "Go and the Lord be with you." David had this amazing faith in God, didn't he? He knew that with God's help, he could take down Goliath. We'll also remember that Joseph did a similar thing when he interpreted Pharaoh's dream. When Pharaoh told Joseph, he heard, when Pharaoh told Joseph he heard that he could interpret dreams, Joseph in Genesis 41 verse 16 said that he could not do it. "It's not in me, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires, or an answer of peace, or put Pharaoh's mind at ease." Also remember that Daniel, after a night in the lion's den, also says, he didn't say that he was able to close the lion's mouth, did he? In Daniel chapter 6 verse 22, we're told that Daniel said, God sent his angel to shut the mouth of the lions so that they would not hurt him. And that's the right thing to do, isn't it? Rather than lifting ourselves up, give God the glory for the things that he has done for us. The third time David was underestimated was when David approached Goliath in verse 42. And it says that Goliath looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He continued saying, "Am I a dog that you come to attack me with sticks?" So the Philistine called on his gods to curse David. And we remember what happens to those that curse Israel. They are cursed themselves. Even though Goliath taunted him and made fun of him, this did not hinder David. His faith didn't shake in any way. He was zealous to defend the Lord's name. Because of this, David called out to the Philistine in a convincing voice, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistines' army to the birds and to the wild animals, and the whole world, all the nations of that time on the earth at that time will know that there is a God in Israel." David really believed that God would gain the victory. He trusted that God would use him. How refreshing it is to see someone volunteering to give his service to the Lord, even when it appeared that he was putting his life in danger. David was able to trust the Lord, even though he had never faced a giant before. And that was because the Lord had helped him in the past in killing the bear, killing the lion. And so he uses these past victories to give him confidence that God would continue to work through him. Therefore, we're told in verse 50, so David prevailed or triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. What he brought with him as a shepherd was a plain shepherd's coat. No spear, no sword, no bow and arrow, but his sling and 5 smooth stones he'd picked up out of the brook. And what we see is the conversation before the battle was longer than the battle itself, as that was over in one quick moment. David was armed with inferior weapons that a shepherd would have, but he was empowered by God. We saw that Saul thought that David needed military gear, and so he offered his own, where David saw the value of what he already had. The sling and the stones appear irrelevant in a fight against the great Goliath, with all his armour and all his weapons. But David just had what he needed to do the job. And we can do the same, can't we? When we have a great Goliath of a problem in front of us, we may feel that what we have isn't enough. We may feel inadequate, but we should use what God has given us. Like David, through God, we might be surprised how much we achieve with it. David's faith in God caused him to look at the giant from a different perspective. When we think about it, Goliath was just merely a mortal man, defying an all-powerful God. David looked at the battle from God's point of view. And if we look at our giant problems that we have, and impossible situations that we have, from God's perspective, we find that God will fight for us. He will be with us. When we put things in a proper perspective, we see more clearly and we can fight more effectively. What we see is that David chose not to wear the king's armour because it felt cumbersome and unfamiliar. He didn't need that heavy armour. David was comfortable with a simple sling, a weapon that he was skilled with at using. We also remember in Judges 15, verse 16, that Samson killed 1,000 men just with a jawbone of an ass. We too don't need to worry about wearing the king's armour. Rather, we need to put on the armour of God. And so the question that quite often comes up when talking about the 5 stones is, why did David choose 5 smooth stones before going to fight Goliath? You know, some presume that David took 5 stones instead of 1 because he had some doubt. However, there's no indication in the story that David was doubting God in any way. Rather, David was simply being prepared. What if the other Philistines attacked him after he killed Goliath? How would he have to defend himself? I know the Lord would have found other ways if that was the way it was to be. Also, he would not have known that 1 stone would be enough to kill the giant. There's nothing in the record that God had told David he would kill Goliath with just 1 stone. Others also speculate that David chose 5 smooth stones because Goliath had 4 brothers and David was preparing himself to kill all 5 giants. The theory is actually based on 2 Samuel 21 verses 15 to 22, in which is a battle at a later date. It lists 4 very large Philistines who were related to Goliath in some way. The record says that these 4 were born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and his servants. 1 Chronicles chapter 20 verse 5 also talks about a brother of Goliath being killed. But here in 1 Samuel 17, there is nothing to indicate that David was thinking that he would get 4 more stones to fight against Goliath's brothers. The Israelites were fixated on fear, but David was focused on something bigger. David was focused on God and God's glory. He didn't need to know Goliath's strength because he already knew God's. The soldiers had been focused on something very different. What they told David when he arrived was the king will greatly enrich the man who kills him and will give him his daughter and make his family free in Israel. They were focused on risk and reward, where David just focused on the battle to come. Trusting in God is bigger than fear, bigger than personal gain. Trusting in God means positioning ourselves to the bigger, which is our God. Israel trusted in their king. The Philistines trusted in their warrior. But David trusted in God. And this is what David teaches us about trusting God. Before David's arrival, Goliath defied the ranks of Israel for 40 days. For 40 days the Philistines had come forward and taken a stand, morning and night. And for 40 days all the Israelites let their fear consume them. That also can be like the things that are troubling us. Just like Goliath, they're there worrying us day and night. When we go to bed, when we wake up in the morning, it just won't go away. It troubles us all the time. And because of this, we too can be consumed in fear. Where our thoughts should be like David's thoughts, which would have been similar to the words of Psalm 60 verse 11. Through God we will do valiantly, for it is He who will tread down our enemies. Through God we will do great things. Proverbs chapter 3 verses 5 and 6, Judy's favourite quotes or verses. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him and He will make straight your paths. You know, the same thing happened when the 12 spies came back from viewing the promised land. They all saw the same thing. They all agreed on the description of the land. The difference was their faith or their lack of it. Because the 10 said, the people there are too strong for us. We felt like grasshoppers. Where Joshua and Caleb said, they're strong. It won't be easy, but with God's help, we will succeed. Great words, aren't they? Exactly the words that Moses and God wanted to hear. It won't be easy, but with God's help, we will succeed. We then need to ask, which one was the underdog? Because people today often use the phrase David and Goliath with the meaning of an underdog situation, a contest where there's a smaller, weaker opponent facing a much bigger, stronger adversary. Goliath was the foot soldier that was good at fighting in close combat, where David was good at fighting from a distance with a sling and a stone. So in some ways, David had an advantage because of that. Whereas Goliath was very tall, had amazing armour and weapons. But who really was the underdog when David came in the name of the Lord? When we're in the Lord, it doesn't matter how big or small, fat or tall we are. If we have faith in the Lord, He will work in us and with us and strengthen us for His service. And so the underlying purpose of the story of Goliath is to show that Saul was not fit to be the king and that David was. Saul was chosen to lead the Israelites against their enemies, but when faced with Goliath, he refuses to do so. Even when he was a head taller than anyone else in all Israel. And so he was the obvious challenger for Goliath, wasn't he? Yet David is the one who eventually defeated him, not because of his size, but because of the size of his faith in God. Israel trusted in their numbers. When they were a complete army, they were great, especially when the Lord was with them. And that worked for them. That is until Goliath made the battle, not about the collective, but about the individual. The war of the many Israelites and Philistines became a victory decided by two, Goliath versus his challenger. Israel needed to place their trust in an individual, but no one in Saul's entire army dared to take on Goliath. That is, no one, except for David, accepted the challenge. Despite his faults, David's words and deeds set him apart. In contrast to Saul, who refused to fight, David proves himself to be a worthy successor to the throne of Israel. He does not hesitate to run into battle and defend Israel in an unexpected way, showing that he is better than Saul, and he was a king worthy of becoming a foreshadow of the Messiah. For Jesus, the greater David, has also saved his people in an unexpected way. As David defended the Philistines, so the Messiah, the shoot and branch that came from the stump of Jesse, is the individual that took on the flesh and overcame. He gained the victory over sin and death. And what we see is that death is overcome by life. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 55 to 57 says, "O death, where is your power? O death, where are your pains? The pain of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But praise be to God, who gives us strength to overcome through our Lord Jesus Christ." And Philippians 1 verse 28, which we finish with this morning, tells us, "Don't be afraid of your enemies. Always be courageous, and this will prove to them that they will lose and that you will win, because it is God who gives you the victory." And that's something good to remember, isn't it?